Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, first part there for the 24th of September 2024. Let's get straight to where we normally start, Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. And we have some very high figures again in a number of these categories. Really is a trend that is taking place. 1,400 personnel lost. That is over the 1,300 upper range that I had arbitrarily set, that kind of 1,000 to 1,300. We have seen now a number of days of over 1,300. 16 tanks lost, that's pretty much double the daily average. 40 troop carrying AFVs, that's over double the daily average. 61 artillery systems, over 3 times the daily average. These are huge numbers being posted. 1 multiple launch rocket system, 3 anti-aircraft warfare systems is a high number there too. 73 vehicles and fuel tanks is huge, and 10 pieces of special equipment. This is a massive list of equipment, and we have seen now 3 days of really high numbers. Are we seeing that reflected in the Andrew Perpetual loss list? Well, we've had a couple of days where we haven't had any, and he caught up yesterday. Remember, before there was some massive lists that do suggest that these trends, we can't necessarily say that these are, one-to-one accurate. But whenever the numbers go up significantly, Andrew Perpetual's lists seem to go up significantly. So there is definitely a form of accuracy to the general staff figures. That is incontrovertible as far as I'm concerned. We have seen that time and time again. We saw that when the Russians were attacking in Avdiivka, when they were throwing all sorts of equipment there, and that was caught. All of that was caught on, well, much of it was caught on visual confirmation on video and still images, so that we could somewhat confirm the general staff claims, and that's what we're seeing again. So you would expect there to be, especially with a couple of days lag, there to be a very large set of losses for the Russians. And what do we see in the first day of the 2 days? A massive list of Russian losses. I know I say this ad infinitum, but 50% of the viewers are unique and new, and they don't necessarily know all the things I said. But also, the Russian trolls will come and say, why didn't you give Ukrainian figures? Well, because I don't have those figures. No one produces them. But if you're looking at visual confirmation, then you're looking at fractions of the Russian losses. Now, there are days when there's parity. There are days when things are much closer because the Ukrainians might be attacking up in places like Kursk. But generally, the attacking force, the Russians are throwing equipment and personnel at the Ukrainians all along the front, and you would expect them to be losing an awful lot of equipment. The general staff claim they're losing a lot of equipment, and we're seeing it on the socials. So here we have a 3-to-1 loss ratio, but in terms of combat losses, may even be 4-to-1 in combat asset losses. Let's look at the Ukrainian losses for 2 days ago. Strela 10 air defense system, that's going to hurt. That's been destroyed. Short range air defense system, not newest or best, but still, that is going to be a little bit painful. Then we have usual mix of stuff, some tanks there, T-64s, a couple of those, a couple of unknown ones. Number of APCs, Humvees, BTRs, M113B, RDM, that suggests that the Ukrainians are on the attack at least somewhere, and one would assume that's Kursk. A couple of MRAPs as well, and then trucks, ATV, civilian vehicles, usual kind of stuff. As far as the proportion of damage against destroyed, it is overwhelmingly destroyed and abandoned, but there are a few damage thrown in there. When it comes to the Russian losses, slightly better on the tank front for damage versus a destroyed or abandoned, but that's an absolute bucket load of tanks. Worse when it comes to infantry fighting vehicles and APCs. Okay, going to the top, air defense system, a Book M3, and we've got proof of that one in the visuals. So here we have Russian Book M3 somewhere in Kursk region was detected by a Ukrainian drone. The air defense unit was about to leave its position when a Gimler, so HIMARS, precisely struck its position, destroying the vehicle and probably its entire crew. So that is a Book M3 taken out there, some electronic warfare equipment. Then we come down to a recovery vehicle, Prem 1, a couple of excavators. We have a Grad launcher, an MTLB with a Grad launcher. Interesting. So that's one of these Franken Sam ones, well, Franken Mad Max style MTLB chassis, and they put things like rocket launchers from ships, anti-submarine like rocket launchers, and then all these sort of different pieces of kit they whack on the MTLB chassis. Here we've got a Grad launcher, multiple launch rocket system that's been taken out, that's fully destroyed. And when it comes to tanks, we've got 7 tracked garden sheds, many of those destroyed or abandoned. We have tank with mine rollers, and then just a general range of tanks there. Some of them unknown, just probably husks of what they previously were. Infantry fighting vehicles, heavy loss there. So in terms of tanks, that's 20 plus tanks just there. I mean, that's incredible. Infantry fighting vehicles, almost similar amount there. Teens in the teens for the IFVs there. BMP2s, BMP3s, and BTRs. APCs, 1 captured, a Baran ASV, and a couple of other ones in there destroyed, abandoned. And then trucks, ATVs, civilian vehicles, usual suspects there. So a very bad day at the office, I think, for the Russians, losing an awful lot of combat assets, particularly tanks there, and that is going to hurt them in terms of unsustainable losses. You can't lose that many tanks as frequently as they do. When it comes to the most recent day, still quite a lot of Russian losses. It's somewhat equalized. There's a bit of parity here, a lot of civilian vehicles on both sides. Ukrainians losing quite a few bits of artillery here. Remember, artillery, what we see from the general staff, so the last couple of days, we had a record day yesterday and an incredibly high day today in terms of artillery pieces lost by the Russians. That's 61 today. But you will not see that on the loss list. And if you were, I think, to have an accurate sense of what was going on, these lists would be absolutely massive, and they'll be overwhelmingly bad for the Russians, because there'll be an awful lot of Russian artillery on this list. Yes, some Ukrainian, but I think the Ukrainians are doing and have done for years now, since the beginning of May 2023, when they went on a counteroffensive, the Ukrainians that is, it all went a bit wrong around Malatok, Kamachka, and they realised they had to take out Russian artillery, and that's when you started seeing this spike in Russian. It's no longer a spike; it's just a massive trend towards huge artillery losses. And if you were to add a reflection of that to these losses, then Russia would lose far more per day than the Ukrainians. Anyway, today, or the latest list by Andrew, is probably due to get out another one, actually, in all honesty, because this is really yesterday's one. We have some artillery for the Ukrainians there, including an HS Crab. That's the South Korean, Polish crossover there. We've got a HIMARS hit by an Iskander strike. Extent of damage is unknown. Could be minimal. So interesting. That's obviously cool. I've not seen that footage. So damaged HIMARS. That's not something you often see. Hopefully that's not too bad. Luckily, the proportion of destroyed to damaged is good for the Ukrainians in today's list. We have 3 damaged tanks. We have a couple of IFVs taken out, BMP2s. APCs, a couple of those, M113 and Striker damaged, and then MRAPs mainly damaged. A lot of destroyed civilian vehicles. And then coming up to the Russians, likewise civilian vehicles, a lot of ATVs, these quad bikes taken out. And then in the combat asset losses, they have usual range of artillery there. Some in the tank category, they've got 8 tanks lost, which is pretty significant. 6 of them, so 3/4 of them destroyed or abandoned, including 3 track garden sheds again. So really working hard on adapting those tanks, and it often makes those tanks, it's either a reflection that those tanks aren't fully operational, or it makes them not operational, which means that tanks are not as important to the Russians as basically glorified APCs. So these tanks get used to clear the way at the head of the vanguard of a mechanized assault, and they attract those drones to hit them. But they also have personnel underneath the metal sheeting as well. So they seem to be in more need of these glorified APCs than they are of tanks. Okay. Yesterday, in the cross direction, the 25th Airborne Assault Brigade destroyed 15 Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, other wheeled vehicles, and dozens of infantry. So again, the Russians are, like we always say, they are grinding on. They are taking serious amounts of land. It is not looking good down on the Eastern Front for the Ukrainians. Vuhledar is going to fall. Pokrovsk is very much threatened, but actually there is a whole series of settlements, beneath Pokrovsk or southeast of Pokrovsk, where the Russians are just moving and taking. They are moving across huge amounts of farmland, and they are also moving towards Karakova as well. So it's not looking good for the Ukrainians, but the macro view, I think, is somewhat better for the Ukrainians. Indeed, Anders Puk Nielsen produced a video this morning on the Russian economy and actually how, although some people don't believe that the Russian economy couldn't sustain a war for like infinite amounts of time, because they think Russia's this huge country with bottomless pits of cash and hydrocarbons, actually they are not in a good position. And he's got a video to show that, or to explain that that they are more vulnerable than many people think. There's your book M3 that I talked about. Now, this is a typical video. I mean, we see this quite often. Russians with their dash cams just driving down the road, and you just get an idea of the sheer volume of equipment that you can see. So Russian correspondents visited the village of Vysokoye in the Glushkovsky district. So that is just underneath the same river in the Kursk region where the Ukrainians are attacking towards. As visible, there's practically no destruction of civilian infrastructure. So the Ukrainians not flattening places like the Russians do when the Russians go into, to scare quotes, liberate Ukrainian land. They just obliterate everything. But on the other hand, the Ukrainians go in and they are very targeted in what they do. The roads here, though, are littered with Russian destroyed equipment here. So I'm going to, just going to put this on to 2 times playback speed and see where that gets us. Yeah, okay. And just get a sense of how much equipment is destroyed, as these roads are generally under fire control from drones, tanks and trucks and SUVs and infantry fighting vehicles, cope cages, all over stuff. It just gives you an idea that you are doing run the gauntlet every time. And even this car is essentially running the gauntlet. And I would be pretty on edge with regard to driving anywhere. Anyway, that was just a little insight to the destruction on the roads. And then someone coming in, one of these journalists come in to see if there's any destruction to civilian infrastructure in the area, which isn't really the case. But yeah, there's just a lot of destroyed vehicles in and around Kursk. We have, this is relatively new thing. I mean, I've shown it to you before with regard to the ability for Baba Yagas and these, well, they're called, Baba Yaga does a lot of heavy lifting, quite literally as a term. It's not the formal term. You get these vampire drones that maybe you can get hexacopters, octocopters, just larger drones, often just generally called the Baba Yaga drones. And we have seen them. I've seen a Wild Hornet, a Queen Hornet, I think it was, dropping a TM62 anti-tank mine. And these are heavy bits of kit, like 10 kilogram mines, 9.5 kilogram mines, I think. And have I seen them carrying 2? Anyway, here we've got footage of them dropping TM62 anti-tank mines on vehicles, and those vehicles going kaboom. So this is another useful kind of evolution of the capabilities of these drones to drop really significant explosives that are going to do much more damage than, so if you remember, we've seen like thousands of videos are out there of dropping little hand grenades or incendiary devices, and you try and get them through the hatch of usually abandoned vehicles, but you're not usually going to incapacitate a vehicle that is up and running and fine with those smaller incendiary devices or hand grenades or whatever. But with a mine, you can find a fully functional infantry fighting vehicle or tank, and you can totally destroy it by dropping a mine on top of it. And the top is the weakest part of the vehicle. They are designed to withstand mines to some degree beneath. but dropping one on top of a tank or an RFV is going to have some serious repercussions. Okay. Thanks to artificial intelligence, defenders detect 12,000 units of Russian equipment every week, according to the Ministry of Defense. Avenger's platform is unique in the world in terms of the volume of video data with enemy equipment. Okay, this is just a little bit of a segue for me. I think I've got the bit on it in the military aid video coming later, but Robert Magyar from Magyar's Birds, the guy who does an awful lot of fundraising and is at the forefront of drone usage in Ukraine in terms of training up people to be the very best, getting the best equipment, because he does all that fundraising himself, kind of unilaterally, and being on a cutting edge of technological advances. So if you want to be in a drone team, you'd want to be in his drone team or one of his drone teams. But what you'd really want is what he does spread right across the Ukrainian army. But he was saying, I believe, that in something like 6 months, and this could be bombastic rhetoric, but he was saying like 6 months' time, you won't have drone operators on the battlefield. I'm sure it's something like that. I'll have to check it out. But he seems to be fairly confident that, I presume, artificial intelligence or automation, they must be working really hard on automating drones in order to keep drone operators safe, keep their personnel safe, and just it could be a time where the Terminator is reality, and that reality is relatively soon. Now, here's a video of a Russian drone, and the Ukrainians intercepted this feed, right? So they essentially captured the Russian feed here. This is Nikopol. Nikopol's on the northern shore of the Zaporizhia reservoir. And it has been, like, Nikopol and Mahanets have been absolutely hammered for 2.5 years by Russian artillery. Here is a war crime. This is, I think that Erland here said that these are unguided rockets. They're not. I don't think they're rockets. I think they're flares. I think this drone is flying over Nikopol and firing flares into civilian neighborhoods to set fire to houses. This is a war crime. Like, this is indiscriminate destruction of civilians and their houses. It's just incredible. That's what the Russians are like. Don't be under any illusion that Russia are not war criminals and monsters in this war. And which is what really frustrates me. We'll come on to it a little bit later in the other section, when you have people, seemingly blaming the US for the war and exonerating Russia and the Russians in this. It's just, it blows my mind. Anyway, I digress. Here we have in Omsk in Russia, and not for the first time, 2 middle school students have broken into a military base and set fire to a Mi-8 helicopter. There are various claims as to, some said it was with a cigarette, others with a Molotov cocktail. It could be both. Cigarette lighting, a Molotov cocktail. And anyway, that's the end of that military helicopter. Thank you very much, Russian school children. They have been apprehended. I don't know what you do with kids that young, who have done something pretty significant to destroy some military capability there. And then we have Russia on fire. This time we visit Moscow city centre, says Tim White. It's reported that the roof of the finance ministry building was on fire. It seems to have been undergoing some sort of reconstruction on Bolshoi Cherkassky Perulka Lane. That's a ministry building with its roof on fire. Another Russia on fire incident. Okay, not a lot to report. There's only just one tab in my strikes information today. So the Ukrainian Air Force has reported another large drone attack overnight. This is insanely consistent, and the Russians have clearly got a large capacity to build these things or procure them. In addition, missiles were also launched. So in terms of the drones, 81 Shahed drones were sent into Ukraine. That's a massive number. 66 were shot down and 13 were lost due to electronic warfare. So that is a 79 out of 81 effective interception rate there. That's exceptionally good. Possibly only 2 Shaheds reaching their intended targets. Those shot down in terms of missiles were unfortunately none of them. 0 out of 4 missiles we have an Iskander-M ballistic missile, which is very difficult for the Ukrainians to shoot down. 2 cruise missiles got through, both those KH-59 or 69 cruise missiles, and 1 unknown missile type got through. I don't know where they hit. I have no details of strikes overnight. There's an awful lot of talk going on that's kind of strangling the bandwidth to do with Zelensky being in the US at the moment and NATO and so on and so forth. Okay, on to other bits and pieces. I thought I'd just remind viewers that the war takes its toll right across society. And I'm not giving a poet any more value than a bricklayer, like I've said before. You know, there is no, you know, every human has their own pathway and their own rights and utility and autonomy, etc., etc. And it's not like a poet is somehow better than any other human. So why am I pointing this out? It's just to remind you the sheer scope of destruction and terror that this war forces on the Ukrainian population, the Ukrainian society, whether it be a sports player, a bricklayer, an accountant, a student, or someone who's unemployed. You know, these people are dying, and Ukraine is becoming all the poorer for that, both literally and figuratively. Anton Gerashchenko says Ukrainian poet Taras Ilya, the call sign General, the son of 2 other poets, Valentina Ostrochenko and Valery Ilya, died defending Ukraine. Taras was a poet, winner of the Oles Huncha Prize in 2013 for his collection of poems, Roots of the Ocean. He was also a member of the Dynamo Kiev fan movement. Eternal memory and eternal glory to Ukrainian hero. Just another human life lost in defense of a country and in a war that is not the fault of the US, is not the fault of Ukraine. Yes, trying to unpick causality is notoriously difficult. I've written a book on it, right? And it's how the universe started. And I can tell you that is causally pretty damn complicated. The book is Did God Create the Universe from Nothing? Countering William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. If you want to know about causality and how difficult it is to unpick, you read that book. Now, trying to unpick the causality of this war, it will be super difficult. You could most accurately say that the entire universe in the preceding moment to the start of the war was the cause of the war starting. Okay, what we do as humans is we pick proximal causes, and that's often a bit not very accurate. It was not accurate enough, and so we end up then going back and back, but then you just get back to the Big Bang. So, you know, where do you kind of cut off and say that caused that? Because we can always find a cause, an antecedent cause for that cause, and then you're trying to understand the ultimate cause of all of this. Well, Big Bang, etc., etc. Okay, so when we say what caused the war, it is really difficult, and we do have to kind of go, well, this thing caused it more than these other things, but actually everything's involved in this war coming to be, right? So if you didn't have the United States of America, you probably wouldn't have this war, but you wouldn't have all sorts of things. So you could say, well, the US plays some causal role in how the war started. But in terms of, you know, moral responsibility and blame, as much as you can, and again, that's a really difficult philosophical area, Russia are largely to blame for this war. Like, Putin sent his troops into Ukraine in 2014, and he sent his troops into Ukraine in 2022. And I don't think we need to be too highfalutin philosophically about really who's to blame and what the cause of the war is, especially when you're trying to communicate to the general public in, say, the US. So anyway, I'm going to move on to this section to do with the cause of the war. And I know this is normally what I do in the geopolitics section, but there's an awful lot going on. And there are some claims from Zelensky. So he's in an interview. I'm going to play that to you here that I think are worth dwelling on to try and unpick them.
So your victory plan Does it include, and I know you don't want to get into details until you talk to leaders, but negotiating with Russia, and how can you trust someone?
It's not about negotiating with Russia. No, it's about, like I said, it's a bridge to diplomatic way how to stop the war. The bridge is a plan of victory or victorious plan. It's a strengthening of Ukrainian army and Ukrainian people. Only in the strong position we can push Putin to stop the war, diplomatic way.
Zelensky did not.
So that's really super important. So if you just looked at some of the headlines, so there are lots of people saying, "Oh, you know, I think we're closer to peace than you think. We are closer to the end of the war," is something he said in the interview. And if you were to just take that sentence from the interview, "I think we're closer to peace than we think," you might take away from that Ukraine is close to doing peace negotiations and capitulating maybe to the will of people who want peace. Everyone wants there to be peace, but you know, people who want to rush Ukraine into peace, rather like JD Vance, Donald Trump, and you could argue probably Xi Jinping and others, you know, want to rush him into peace, but that will be to the advantage of Russia. What Zelensky is very clearly saying is the way to do peace, the bridge that we have to travel over to get to peace, is to have military. I don't know, be outright victory anymore. I don't think it's going to be kicking the Russians out of the entirety of Ukrainian territory. There could be some realism there now, whereby we need to be at a military advantage. We need to be kicking Russia's butt enough that we are in a power position when we come to do that diplomacy. And that's exactly right. And that's what a lot of people have said for a long time. It's like, you need to be in the ascendancy so that you sit down to the negotiating table and you're in a power position. That is what Zelensky is saying. And that is super important. Now, he's then come up with this victory plan, which is, you know, it is about victory. It's not about capitulation and negotiation. It is about taking a sense of victory into doing diplomacy with Russia. And this is how the Ukrainians interpret the 4 points to his victory plan.
Appearances in the United States this week. But okay, there's 4 planks. Number 1, security guarantees with harder assurances akin to the defense guarantee that comes from NATO membership. So that draws a distinction between the assurances that Ukraine has gained through individual kind of security pacts, including with the United Kingdom, including with the United States and several other allied countries. Ukrainians welcomed them when they came along, but they're looking for something really solid, something that is along the lines of, in the same kind of league as Article 5, basically. Plank number 2, that's the Kursk operation, essentially taking land in order to become a bargaining chip at the negotiating table. So he basically confirmed that the Kursk operation is part of this victory plan, as we speculated and reported when it was happening. What is the objective? What's going on there? I think we're right to see it in that context. The third plank, specific, underlining the word specific here, that's what's being quoted, advanced weapons. Those advanced weapons are not named. We know, of course, there's this big conversation around Storm Shadow and other long-range missiles. Listeners will be familiar with the debate around that over the past few weeks. We thought that there was going to be a green light when our current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, went to Washington to speak to Joe Biden. It didn't happen. Then there was talk that maybe it will happen in United Nations General Assembly week. That is this week. So maybe it's about that. It might also be around air defences. That's another big issue, possibly, and I'm really speculating here. Maybe it's got something to do with NATO shooting down drones over Western Ukraine. Don't know. I am speculating. But specific advanced weapons, I'm not telling you which ones I want, he said. And the fourth plank is discussion of Ukraine's economic recovery. The way the FT put it is joint development of Ukraine's economy together with its partners. Slightly clunky, that, but I think we get the picture. We know the Ukraine has suffered massively economically during this war and is going to need help getting back on its feet. So those are what we understand are the 4 elements of the plan. The details we don't yet have. So the details should become public, I assume, sometime during the course of this week. I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail shortly because he's also given an interview to the New Yorker, which is interesting. But just so listeners are aware of the timetable, so President Zelensky is already in the United States. He is meant to address a meeting of the United States Security Council tomorrow that's being called by Ukraine's allies. The day after that, so on Wednesday, he is meant to address the United Nations General Assembly. This is big week. You keep saying big week. Like it's an episode in the Strategic Joint Bomber Offensive or something, but it is a diplomatic big week. It's the annual jamboree when world leaders, all kinds of world leaders are going to be there. Benjamin Netanyahu's going to be there. There's going to be all kinds of reasons to look at what happens in New York this week. Zelensky's day on the stage, we believe, is on Wednesday. And then on Thursday, that's when he's meant to have separate meetings, according to the White House, with Joe Biden and with Kamala Harris. And Zelensky's also said he intends to meet with Donald Trump as well to explain this victory plan to Donald Trump. We are
more on that in a second, because some deeply problematic things were said last night again by Trump concerning this.
Not what I personally am not clear on the timing of that, or whether Donald Trump's camp has confirmed it's happening, but that's his plan for the next few days. Now, President Zelensky has also given a much more detailed interview to the New Yorker's Joshua Yaffa. It is worth reading in full, as Mr. Zelensky's interviews usually are, as most stuff that Josh Yaffa writes, to be honest. But I've been through it. It does give a few more details, not too much more detail of the specifics of the plan, but it talks a bit more about his thinking behind it, which I think is interesting. And I'm just going to read out a paragraph here, which I think encapsulates the whole thing. So in this section of the interview, Josh has asked President Zelensky about the objective of the plan. And he says, well, the victory plan is a plan that swiftly strengthens Ukraine. A strong Ukraine will force Putin to the negotiating table. I'm convinced of that. It's just that before I was only saying it, and now I've put it all on paper with, and I've highlighted this bit, specific arguments and specific steps to strengthen Ukraine during the months of October, November and December, and to enable a diplomatic end of the war. The difference this time will be that Putin will have grasped the depth of this plan, of our partner's commitment to strengthening us, and he will realize an important fact, that if he is not ready to end this war in a way that is fair and just, and instead wishes to continue to try to destroy us, then a strengthened Ukraine will not let him do so. Not only that, but continuing to pursue that goal would also considerably weaken Russia, which would threaten Putin's own position. Now,
this is huge, right? This is absolutely huge. This is probably the biggest news we've heard in months and months. Arguably, you could say in a year. This is Zelensky saying that I've got a plan that if it goes to plan, then you will see stuff happening in the next 3 months, up to December. October, November, December. And we'll be in such a position then that Putin will realise the predicament he's in and be forced to the negotiating table. Now, will the West agree to that plan and agree to fulfill those steps with Zelensky? I don't know, but that is a very bold statement from his interview in the New Yorker.
Now, I've picked out that paragraph for two reasons. The first thing is it gives you a time frame that tells you how urgent this is, right? October, November, December. Zelensky wants this thing done, dusted, nailed down before January, before Joe Biden leaves office.
So the question is that because he is deeply worried about a potential Trump presidency, or is it because things are so desperate for the Ukrainians that they need to do something now, because any prolonged war will attrit their forces so much that actually they would be fundamentally weakened? That's another interpretation of the desire for immediacy.
He talks about that very specifically, and he talks about how Joe Biden's got this opportunity to go down in history as the guy who nailed down an eventual peace. And I think that speaks to the nerves around the election, the nerves around the chance of Donald Trump becoming president again, and just the sense that this is a crucial period of time for Ukraine. So that's one thing. The other thing, the reason I pulled this out, is because I think that this speaks to, we don't have the details. I haven't seen the details yet. We will, and we'll talk about those details when they come out. But the principle here is, I think, very sound, all right? And it observes a basic tenet of the bleeding obvious, I would say, which is that battlefields are negotiating tables, quite literally. There's not really a distinction between, there is a distinction, obviously, but people try to make this dichotomy between let's not have war, let's have talks, let's have negotiations instead of fighting. Literally, negotiations are going on the battlefield right down. You fight for the upper hand to go into talks, to compel your opponent to enter talks or to entertain peace in a weaker position, you with the upper hand. It's exactly what we're seeing with these Israeli strikes on Hezbollah right now. All right, that's just war. That's the way it goes. And this discussion of, okay,
the old classic politics by any other means type thing. This is why I've been talking about the importance of Kursk, right? And some people will be going, Putin would never negotiate over Kursk, so he will take that back and blah, blah, blah. But they are in Kursk because Kursk has more value than defending like that same amount of land down in Donetsk is not the same value. Kursk inside Russia, Ukrainians controlling that is worth twice as much of Russians controlling land down here. Right? It is incredibly important, and this is part of his victory plan, as has been stated, and that's the context with which we need to understand Kursk and why it either is or isn't a successful thing to have done, or the right thing to have done.
I think it's fair to say that Zelensky here, the tenor of everything he's saying, his political posture, the rhetoric that's coming out of Kyiv over the past several weeks and months, I think we can talk about him trying to set up the chessboard for the end game, but a relatively favourable end game. And I think the idea of getting it through on the battlefield, sending that message to the Kremlin that, look, you're not going to make much more gain by fighting, and illustrating that the West is solidly behind us to force the Kremlin to weigh up its cost-benefits analysis here is very sound in principle. And for that, for my money, Dom, my last kind of thought on this that I leave you with, I think that makes, we've talked about Kursk already. Kursk is obviously a critical part of that because it gives the Ukrainians a chunk of Russian land to play with. The other critical part is what is happening in Donbass. If this is going to work, the Ukrainians are going to have to stabilize that line somehow, because at the moment, the sense, at least the trajectory of things down there is not looking good. Christopher Miller, our friend of the podcast, has a...
Yeah, and I talked through Christopher Miller's article the other day. It is bad down in Donbass, and so there are questions about whether the Ukrainians have these reserve forces and what they're going to do with them. Is it that they really don't have enough equipment for them, or do they have some greater plan? But I don't know for sure. But there's this sense that this could be the beginning of the end. We could have got to a period where actually Zelensky is voicing a pathway to the end of the war. And if the West is on board with that, give them a load of stuff they need, Ukraine do some seriously good stuff on the battlefield and hammer the Russians in really significant ways, like you've seen with the ammunition depots over the last week, but maybe with some air bases, maybe we're taking out some really high value targets. 3 months of that, just a bit of a blitzkrieg for the Ukrainians. They've got some reserves ready to go. You just give them, we want this. If you give us that, this is our plan. This is what we're going to do. Bish bash bosh. You do it right now. We're open to negotiations. Whether the Russians would want to go to the negotiating table, that would be then on them. Okay, but really interesting stuff here. Now, I am going to juxtapose this, and I'm sorry if you are still someone who is pro-Trump, right? But if you listen to him at rallies in the last 24 hours, denigrating Zelensky and denigrating his own freaking country, I can't help you guys. I can't help you if you're still one of his guys, right? I am for Ukraine. This guy is not for Ukraine. So this is what he's saying at a rally to thousands of people.
Naturally, they're reduced now to using young boys and old men. Young boys and old men, because their people have been killed. So many of their people have been killed that they are using young boys to fight the war and old men. How about that? It's what a horrible thing has happened just because, and it's our fault because it's a war that should have never been allowed to happen, and we had the power that it would never have happened. We have an incompetent leader. Naturally.
So he's blaming the US. So he's saying it's our fault. We've got an incompetent leader. Doesn't blame Putin. Doesn't freaking blame Putin. It's our fault. It's the US's fault that war started. What are you doing? Like, how can you be running to be president of the most important country in the world, top of the hegemonic ladder, and you're blaming your own country? Putin's sitting back in the Kremlin laughing. He's high-fiving Shoigu and Belousov and Gerasimov. Like, awesome. information war did a job here. We've done one over the presidential nominee. This is outrageous, right? And then you get this stuff.
But Ukraine now, I see Zelensky is here. I think Zelensky's the greatest salesman in history. Every time he comes into the country, he walks away with $60 billion. Billion!
Now, you and I, we're here because we think Zelensky's great and Ukraine is doing an amazing job, and Ukraine is a country that's been attacked by an aggressive invader who are committing war crimes all over the shop, right? And we are in a position to be able to help them at some cost to us. Someone's drowning in a lake. I can save you. You don't know how to swim. I know how to swim. I can save you. I'm going to get wet doing it. I know that, but it's the right thing to do. But I am going to get wet. Like, it might be a cost to us, but it's the right thing to do. Not only for us, actually. Not only for them, but for us. Strategically, geopolitically. And here's a guy that is saying stuff that is making crowds boo Zelensky. Not freaking boo Putin. He's not saying anything. He's not saying a single bloody thing to get thousands of people there to denigrate and boo and morally evaluate Putin. Instead, he's picking the victim and he's getting people to boo the victim. And you want to vote for that man? You want to vote for that despicable human? I am no longer going to try and paint this nicely. Like, if you support that man, you need to take a look at yourself morally.
$60 billion. Billion! Walks in with $60 billion. He wants them to win this election so badly. But I would do differently. I will work out peace as president-elect. If I win this election, the first thing I'm going to do is call up Zelensky and call up President Putin, and I'm going to say...
Notice he calls him President Putin and just Zelensky. Take note of the little things.
You gotta make a deal. This is crazy. Zelensky is here. I think Zelensky's the greatest salesman in history. Every time he comes into the country, he walks away with $60 million. No, he doesn't. $60 million was held up for 7 months by the Republicans. By you. He's been to the country a few times. He's there now. Would he walk out with $60 billion? Hopefully he'll walk out with some support from NATO for his victory plan. But it's absolutely disgusting, this kind of approach. And I am completely at a loss as to how you can think this guy is going to be the best thing for Ukraine. You can think he's going to be the best thing for immigration. Sure enough, you can make whatever argument for Trump you like, but you are not justified in thinking he would have Ukraine's best interests at heart, because he's telling you in his own words that he doesn't care one iota. JD Vance, his number 2, has told you, and he is a number 2, has told you that he doesn't care for Ukraine. In his own words, why do people not want to believe what they're hearing? Are they so far into love for this guy that he can do no wrong, even when he overtly says things that are wrong? And finally, because we know that Russia are nice guys, here we have a guy saying that if a Ukrainian in occupied territory speaks Ukrainian, because you know that Russian's been outlawed in Ukraine, right? You know that because that's what the Russians tell you. Except that's not true. Here we have got a Russian blogger, Fedorov, published an interview with a Russian military officer revealing that Ukrainians in occupied territories, and remember this, I showed you this before, I'm just reminding you this, are being kidnapped for speaking Ukrainian. Russia invaded Ukraine, claiming they were protecting Russian culture so that they could destroy Ukrainian culture. That is genocide. So I just say that it's just another little random thing. It's like, you know, if you want to give a permission structure for this kind of behavior, then by all means don't slag off Putin and try and get your audience to denigrate Zelensky. If that's your game, you go for it, mate. But you ain't got my support, and you shouldn't have any rational, decent human being support for that kind of approach. It's not only naive, it's morally reprehensible. End of rant, over and out.